and good evening, everyone. My name is Pranav Anand. I'm the faculty director of the Humanities Institute here at UC Santa Cruz. We also call the institute THI, and it's a research and public engagement arm of the Humanities Division. THI is a hub for bold projects in the humanities. This past year, for example, we provided research fellowships to 27 graduate students, and I want to briefly mention two of them because they're finishing their dissertations as we speak. The first is Arlo Fosberg, who is a student from Feminist Studies, and whose research investigates the history and self-narratives of U.S. land-grant colleges and how their focus on broadening higher education across poor white farmers was built on the mass dispossession of indigenous peoples from their lands. The second is Juan Gian from History of Consciousness, whose research examines the interaction between the birth of AI at the turn of the 20th century and the contemporaneous psychoanalytic tradition of the mind. In addition to this kind of direct support for research, a cornerstone of THI's work is connecting the broader public with the scholarship of our faculty. And so we're thus really, really excited for this project, a two-session reading group on the Odyssey led by two faculty from our Ancient Studies program, Martin Devecka and Anne Kreps. The Odyssey is on everyone's news feeds in the past few months, thanks to the combined power of Matt Damon, Anne Hathaway, Charlize Theron, Christopher Nolan, and now, in the past day, Michael Caine. So many of us know the beats of this enduring epic, but it's all too rare nowadays to read it cover to cover. And doing so prompts us to really engage not simply with the storylines we all know, but also to connect with the work as a whole. For me, it's been illuminating to see, for example, the centrality of Athena throughout the narrative and to immerse myself in the mind of Odysseus, who is far more complex and disturbing than I had originally remembered. Beyond this, the talk about the text by the text and this text by Emily Wilson immediately brings up questions about translation and authenticity. AI translation tools have really radically reshaped our interaction with other languages in many ways, but reducing the friction of translation comes with many costs. And one is that we often fail to see the craft, the work, and really the slippage that comes with translating across languages. When we read a work in translation, we're reminded that not only the difficulty of the task of translation, but also the virtues of reading works, particularly poetic ones, in the original language. And I'm taken by this line in Wilson's translation note about translation as a kind of sonic cover. She says, I've spent many hours reading aloud both the Greek original and my own work in progress. Homer's music is quite different from mine, but my translation sings to its own regular and distinctive beat. Okay, but you're here not to hear from me. Tonight's session runs as follows. First, Anne Kreps will situate our conversation of the work done with the Ancient Studies program. Then Martin Devecka will talk for about 40 minutes about the first 12 books of the Odyssey, and then we'll open it up to your questions, moderated by Anne, for about 15 minutes. We're using a webinar tool, so there's no chat function. Instead, we ask you to submit your questions at any point in the Q&A box that you should see in a corner. Finally, tonight's event is being recorded and will be available after the event. Okay, before we get started, I just want to briefly introduce our faculty in the order in which they'll be speaking to you. So first will be Anne Kreps. Anne Kreps is an associate professor of ancient studies and history. She's a historian of the ancient Near East, and her work specializes in the study of heresies, Gnosticism, and the politics of sacred texts. She's the author of The Crucified Book, Sacred Writing in the Age of Valentinus from University of Pennsylvania in 2022. This book uses Valentinus's Gospel of Truth to examine notions of authority and heresy in religious texts. Her current project, tentatively entitled Dead Sea Revivals, examines the Dead Sea Scrolls within new religious movements in the United States. Kreps teaches courses on the history of the Bible, cults, and religious movements. After Anne talks briefly, we'll hear from Martin Devecka. Martin Devecka is an associate professor of ancient studies and literature and is the program director for ancient studies. He's a cultural historian with a focus on Greek and Roman culture. He's the author of Broken Cities, a historical sociology of ruins, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2020. This book examines the different views of urban ruination across four cultures: classical Greece, imperial Rome, medieval Islam, and in the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan. His new book, which comes out in September of this year, is called Citizen Beast: The Place of Animals in the Roman Empire. It's also published at Johns Hopkins Press, and it examines how animals became incorporated in the Roman Empire and how that process inflects with notions of citizenship and humanity. Devecka teaches classes on Greek, Roman, and Old Iranian literature, including a course in the Odyssey that we'll hear some excerpts from today, and a large online course on the history of magic and spellcasting. Devecka is also the recipient of this year's Dezika's Faculty Teaching Award in the Humanities, given annually to an outstanding faculty instructor. And so we are in great hands today. So with that in mind, I'd just like to invite Anne up to the virtual podium to get us underway. Take it away, Anne.
Thank you, Pranav, and thanks to THI for bringing this event to fruition. I'm Anne Kreps. I'm an associate professor of history and also affiliated faculty with ancient studies. And I'd like to welcome you all here this evening and just say a few words about ancient studies. Ancient Studies is a unique undergraduate program at UCSC that brings together literature, history, and the cultures of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world. Our undergraduates form a close-knit cohort in our small professor-led seminars, ancient language study classes, and bond over our informal curriculum at Lupulo's on Fridays. Our program also aims to bring the fascinating ancient world to our modern community here at Santa Cruz in ways that we hope are both informative and fun. Many of you joined us in the spring for our symposium-style event on ritual drinking at Stockwell Cellars. But don't worry if you missed it, there will be another opportunity in the fall. We also host the annual Carl Deppy Lecture. In the winter, Kara Cooney, Egyptologist, gave a provocative lecture on When Women Ruled the World. Please look out for an announcement at the start of the academic year about our next exciting speaker. This evening, we see many people registered who have supported ancient studies institutionally and financially. Many of you have donated at our annual Giving Day events, and others have directly supported our students in experiential travel and language study. We extend our deepest thanks to all of you who have done so in the past, and we remain grateful for your continued support. So now I'm happy to open the first of two virtual events to talk about Homer's epic tale, the Odyssey. Tonight, Martin is going to lead us through books 1 through 12. And on July 1st, at the same time, we'll look at books 24 through 12 through 24. We'll be following Emily Wilson's award-winning translation. But if you are reading a different version, not to worry. Martin loves questions about variation and translation. A question and answer session will follow Martin's discussion. So whenever a question pops into your head, you can pop it into the Q&A chat, and we'll do our best to get to all of them at the end. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Martin.
Hey everyone, welcome to this kind of Odyssey speed run. I guess we are gonna have to go pretty quickly, so why not get started at the beginning? Everyone knows that a beginning is important. So we should start, I think, with the poem. Just start at the very beginning. This is the chunk of the Odyssey that pretty much everyone recognizes. They make you memorize it in graduate school if you're doing classics or ancient studies. And so it may not be clear to us how weird this is vis-a-vis the rest of the Odyssey. And I'm talking about what's called the proem here. Tell me about a complicated man, Muse. Tell me how he wandered and was lost. When he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went, and who he met, the pain he suffered in the storms at sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed to keep them safe, poor fools. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning. I'll tell you why this is weird. It's because it's one of the few places in the poem where Homer is talking in the second person, right? He's directly addressing someone. He's directly addressing someone, and he's even sticking in some first person pronouns, the first person um, singular pronoun and first person plural pronouns. Those first and second person pronouns, I, me, you, don't show up all that much in the narration in the rest of the Odyssey, because generally speaking, the narrator in the Odyssey is narrating in the third person, right? He's talking about other people, what is happening with other people.
Hey, Martin, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we cannot see your slides.
Hmm. How's that? There are no slides as of yet. It is still a blank screen. We are going to get to a slide here. Um, but a few more words about the way that the poem begins. Um, there's a poem, there's a poem that like I said, features first person pronouns and direct address to who? A muse, a kind of a goddess who's associated with memory, who's associated with poetry and the arts, and who becomes the authority then who vouches for the other stuff that Homer is saying. Because two things here. One, the contemporary Greek audience that's hearing this in like the 8th, 7th centuries BCE is not thinking, oh, this is a fictional story. What they're thinking is, this is historical. These are real events that are being recounted to us by a poet who knows, somebody who knows what they're talking about. This poem is a claim of authority, and it's a claim for a special kind of divine knowledge that goes beyond the sort of thing that a person might normally be expected to know, right? And this is um, a point that Homer is going to emphasize at various points in the poem, in the poem, in the rest of the poem, um, including effectively right at the beginning, right? Because the next thing that he is talking about is this conference of the gods, right? And this is happening really right after the proem and a sort of a little bit of background information. Homer is claiming knowledge of what the gods are up to, right? Privileged knowledge. And he'll say things kind of casually like, oh, this is actually Athena who's doing whatever, right? Homer is able to see that stuff because the muse is telling him that stuff. He has this special kind of authority as a narrator, right? The narrator being one of the two sort of main types of voice in the poem. And it's really kind of important to distinguish in reading the poem between stuff that the narrator says and stuff that various figures within the poem say. Because the poem is full of little staged conversations, little chats between various characters within the poem. Sometimes it's possible for characters to overhear one another. Sometimes these conversations are quite private. But the stuff that characters say is, let's say, rhetorically motivated, right? They're trying to make a point. And it doesn't have the same kind of authority by way of describing the world as the stuff that the narrator says. Well, um, after making that remark, we can talk a little bit about this conference of the gods, right? Which is a chat between Athena and Zeus about the main character of the poem, the titular Odysseus. Um, it's a chat that's about Odysseus, but it's also about justice, and justice framed in very concrete terms around a story that's going to come up a lot in the Odyssey, the story of Clytemnestra, Agamemnon, Aegisthus, and Orestes, a family drama of return home that goes very differently and very badly. Well, very differently from how the story of Odysseus is supposed to work out. Because Agamemnon, when he comes home, finds that his wife has not been loyal to him, but is hiding some Aegisthus in the house who is going to come out and kill Agamemnon and leave him unburied. That is an exemplary story of a failed return that results from what even the gods recognize as injustice. And so they're turning around and saying, well, we'll show that we can do the just thing too by making sure that Odysseus gets back home in shape. And this is really part of a kind of a cinematic maneuver on Homer's part, right? He's shifting from the proem, which I think would be basically impossible to stage in a movie. We'll see how Christopher Nolan does it, to a conference of the gods, which you could stage, to a kind of a shot that follows Athena as Athena goes to Ithaca, where she encounters, well, not exactly the person that we were expecting, right? Because she does not encounter there Odysseus. She encounters Telemachus instead. Who is Telemachus? Well, the main thing to know about Telemachus is that he is basically a nobody. Um, Most of the characters, the major characters in the Odyssey, have some sort of background in an epic tradition that predates the Odyssey, other supposedly Homeric poems. Telemachus does not really. Telemachus is a cipher. He's nobody. And that lack of kind of backstory defines him in some other ways too, because he's kind of a good boy in the sense that he has good manners, in the sense that he seems to be doing everything right, but he's ineffectual. He's not really able to get much done. In a way, Telemachus is defined, and this comes out pretty clearly in the first book, by the absence of his father, right? He's defined by a question. Where is Odysseus? Which leads to a second question. Am I really Odysseus's son, right? You can see him asking this around line 215 in the Wilson translation. If I am Odysseus's son, Mentes, who's Athena in disguise, as we know, as readers of the poem, says, "Oh, you kind of look like Odysseus." And Telemachus's response to this is, "I don't know if I'm Odysseus's son." Odysseus for him is a question, multiple levels, a question that defines his character and that defines the trajectory of the poem, right? You might wonder why we're starting with Telemachus instead of with Odysseus. Why we're starting at a time that, as you'll see, is very much not the beginning of the poem chronologically. And that's really to raise a question about where Odysseus is, whether he's coming back, to make Odysseus this kind of compelling absence. Well, Athena comes down, Athena depicted here in this slide. This is a zoom in. We'll see the whole painting next time. Athena comes down and she gives Telemachus some advice about what he is supposed to do. We get a fairly conventional book closing where night falls, everyone goes to sleep. The next book starts in the morning. The next book starts in the morning on the second day of the book. This is a conventional way of stopping narrative action in the Odyssey and a conventional way of bookending a book that will be, let's say, violated to good narrative effect on a few occasions by Homer, this day-night cycle thing. But here, indeed, it is the end of the action and the end of the book. Everyone kind of goes to bed. And we get to book two, where Telemachus is actually trying to execute the program that Mentes has laid out for him. What does this mean? First, it means calling together an assembly of all the main dudes on Ithaca. Um, an agora, an outdoor assembly where people are gonna talk at one another. An assembly that turns out to be, say, less deliberative than conflictual. And conflictual assemblies where people are arguing with one another are really the norm in all the Homeric poems. But this one's definitely conflictual. And so we're going into this, right, because we've been led to see things from Telemachus's point of view, thinking, well, Telemachus is just going to make a case that's totally just, and people are going to hear it and they'll be like, yes, Telemachus really is being treated fairly treated wrongly here. But that's not what happens, right? The scene is staged in a way that makes us even start to wonder whether Telemachus's case or position is just, right? Because who introduces the assembly? It's not Telemachus, it's this other guy. He's named Aegyptus, right? He only shows up at this one point in the poem. And he introduces the assembly by saying, hey, it's been a long time since we've had an assembly. Looking around to line 24 of book 2 in the Wilson translation. It's been forever since we have an assembly. I wonder if there's something really important going on that's a concern for everyone. Like is an army attacking or something like that? Are we all in danger? And then Telemachus takes up the speaking stick and he's like, nope, it's something that concerns me exclusively. I called you all here just to make you deal with my personal problems, which are that I'm being eaten out of house and home. And you should help me if you love my dad as much as I do. By the way, they do not love his dad as much as he does. The reason is that Odysseus basically took all of the young people from Ithaca, led them to Troy, and none of them have come back. Right? So all of these people have lost sons, brothers, husbands, fathers, whatever, because of Odysseus taking all these people to Troy to fight a war that who cares about, really? Um, that being the case, and this is flagged in Aegyptus's speech too, because Aegyptus is described as somebody who had lost a son in the Trojan War. That being the case, people are maybe a little sick of Odysseus. They're sick of Odysseus and they're sick of his house running the island. And so Telemachus drawing attention to this is rhetorically inept. It's rhetorically incompetent, and perhaps even points out the extent to which we should not be on his side. Now, Antinous' speech comes across as a little mean in Emily Wilson's translation. It is in fact, it's very harsh. But it points out that Antinous and the other suitors, all of these guys who are there trying to marry Penelope on the assumption that Odysseus is dead or not coming home, are within their rights according to sort of common law to be doing this. And that if Telemachus really wants them to leave, he should try to get Penelope to marry one of them, because the reason that this suiting has been going on for so long and they've been eating all of his cattle is that, well, Penelope won't choose. She refuses to choose and has been engaging in various kinds of tricksiness to avoid choosing. And I think we would want to see Telemachus and Penelope as being kind of on the same side in this poem because they're members of the same family unit, but they're really not. Right? We see that they too have a conflictual relationship. For instance, Telemachus doesn't tell his mother when he's taken off on the boat trip. He tells his mother to stop interfering in the affairs of the banquet hall. This very kind of weird relationship that they have. And it's structured around a problem that's going to become increasingly clear to us as the story goes on, which is that Telemachus doesn't know where his mother's loyalties lie, right? Telemachus isn't sure if what she really wants to do is marry one of these dudes and give up on his dad, or even worse, do what Clytemnestra did, play a little trick for his dad. So there's a situation that arises from all of these kind of interfamilial conflicts and the fact that Penelope is putting these people off. The basically causes these suitors to hang around for so long suiting uh, in a way that is not necessarily doing wrong. And so various speeches go back and forth on this. We get, from the narrator's point of view, confirmation that Zeus is on Telemachus' side because he sends special birds that show that he endorses Telemachus' point of view. But even that sign is contested, right? Halitherses is the first person who sees it, and he's like, hey, those birds mean that Odysseus is coming back soon. But Eurymachus, one of the suitors, says, well, there are all kinds of birds all over the place. Birds don't really mean anything. Now, that kind of enlightened, non-superstitious view might seem sympathetic to us, but it's totally wrong within the world of the poem. Halitherses is right. But that's knowledge that we have as readers, as an audience. That is not knowledge that people within the world of the poem have. For them, this is all a bit of a mystery. Well, so Telemachus does manage to get this boat ride together with a lot of help from Athena, dressed as mentor this time, different person than mentees, very confusing. And he takes off. And the action actually continues past the end of the day-night cycle. A little narrative device for continuing the action past where you'd think it would stop. But he's sailing to sandy Pylos, the place where Nestor lives. Now he comes up on the shore there, and we get an early introduction to a problem that's going to come up again and again in this book, where people are always washing up on other people's beaches. Where Telemachus and his crew get there, and Nestor and his kids are like, hey, who are you? Are you just dudes out on business? Or are you pirates who have come to sack Pylos? Right? The problem with strangers in this context is that you never know what they're up to. But it turns out that Telemachus is not there to sack Pylos, but to try to get some advice and some information, chiefly of all from Nestor. Who is Nestor? Nestor is a guy who, unlike Telemachus, has a super long history in the epic tradition. It's a lot of backstory. There's a lot of lore on Nestor. He's an extremely important figure in the Iliad, which is another Homeric poem which certainly predates the Odyssey. And even in the Iliad, he's known as a super old guy who knows a lot of stuff and tends to be somewhat long-winded. Nestor, by the way, means the dude who returns. A lot of these names have meanings. Naomai, to return. And the story that he tells, Telemachus, is excerpted as a short version of another epic which is now lost called the Nostoi, or the Returns. There are a bunch of Homeric epics that we don't have. One of the reasons that we don't have them is because the Odyssey eats them, right? Provides summarized versions that hit all the high points. And so why bother keeping around the actual Nostoi when you've got Nestor's summary of it here? Now, his summary of it is basically that things go wrong from the very beginning. And interestingly, the things that go wrong from the very beginning have to do with Athena again, right? Athena is the one who wrecks everybody's boat, who creates this strife between Menelaus and Agamemnon at Troy when they're sailing back from Troy. Athena is to blame for a lot of the stuff that happens. But it turns out that Nestor actually doesn't have all that much useful information for Telemachus, and in fact, he does not have the piece of information that Telemachus really wants, which is confirmation or not that his father is still alive. The person who does have that information is somebody that we meet in book 4. That's Menelaus. Menelaus and his wife Helen, both again, much lore about them. That these are people whose beach Telemachus also washes up on. And he steps into what I think is kind of a frozen domestic continuation of the Trojan War. Because in the story of the Trojan War, as you may know, everything kicks off when Helen is kidnapped. Helen is taken to Troy. Helen is the husband of Menelaus, or possibly Helen goes of her own free will. This is very ambiguous in the tradition, although in the Iliad it really appears to be that she went of her own free will. And so Menelaus brings her back from Troy, but there continues to be this kind of ongoing conflict between them, and that's what um, Telemachus walks into. He walks in kind of at night. He gets there late. Um, there is much weeping and wailing at the recollections of the Trojan War. Helen puts a stop to it using a pharmacon that she throws in the wine, nepenthe. It's also a restaurant that I guess you can go to in Big Sur. She throws this stuff in the wine and it makes everybody super cheerful and they stop crying and it fixes everything. Now that seems great, but it's a little bit threatening too that a woman turns out to have kind of this basic power to control what men consume and how men behave, right? And then the description of Helen's pharmacological knowledge, it's pointed out that she learned to do this trick from an Egyptian potion maker who also knows how to make a lot of fatal poisons, right? Um, Part of the reason, generally speaking, for the poem's distrust of women seems to be this domestic position that they're in, where male characters are effectively dependent on a whole bunch of woman-mediated activities just to be alive, eating food, drinking wine, all that stuff. And that dependency breeds mistrust because these characters are aware of the power that that gives women, power that Helen is in fact exercising here. Well, next day they start talking about Odysseus, and it turns out that Helen and Menelaus remember very different things about him. Now, Helen does say, "Hey, Telemachus, you look just like your dad." And so that does address one of these sort of mysteries about Odysseus that Telemachus has been worried about. He seems to be a little more sure after this point that he is actually Odysseus' son. But Helen also has this story that she tells about Odysseus, Trojan horse story. Well, Menelaus' version is the Trojan horse story. This is an earlier story about Odysseus, where Odysseus sneaks into Troy and Helen recognizes him. Helen is known for being very good at recognizing people. She recognizes Odysseus, but she doesn't give him up. And this is supposed to be evidence, it seems like. Both that Helen is a huge fan of Odysseus. We all love Odysseus, right? Odysseus is great. And that Helen was actually on the Greek side all along, even when she was at Troy. She'd already repented of running away. She really wanted to go back with the Greeks. Now, like I said, Menelaus remembers all this stuff very differently. He also loves Odysseus. We all love Odysseus. But what he remembers is when he and Odysseus and everyone else were inside the Trojan horse. This is at the end of the Trojan War. And Helen, followed around by Deiphobos, who is like her second Trojan husband, who she marries after Paris dies, is walking around the horse, imitating the voices of the various wives of the Greek heroes, who she also knows because she comes from Greece, trying to draw them out if there do happen to be dudes in there. And Odysseus, in this case, has the forethought to put his hand over the mouth of the guy who's going to give them all up. But the point of that story, of course, is that Helen was not on the Greek side, even at the moment when Troy was falling. She had chosen to marry another Trojan and was trying to sabotage the Greek attempts to kind of end this war and take over Troy. The Trojan War is unsettled, at least in this household, although It is over everywhere else. And then, of course, the next day, Menelaus does give actual useful information to Telemachus to the effect that his dad is in fact alive. This is kind of at third hand, but Proteus, the dude who can change shape, is a reliable source. Now, finally, we get to the story of Odysseus. We figure out where he's been all this time. Well, we knew where he was because we heard it from Menelaus, but now we actually see it. He's on the island of Calypso. Calypso means the hider, right? She's been hiding him. She would really like just to hold on to Odysseus. There's this finders keepers rule. Look, I saved him from dying. I should get to keep him, but Hermes comes down and says, you got to let this guy go. And so we finally meet Odysseus. What do we see when we meet Odysseus? Well, we see a dude who's very tactful in not puncturing any of Calypso's beliefs about her own superiority to Penelope. He's very tactful about that, but motivated by nothing so much as a desire to get home, whatever that means. We'll talk about that probably more next time. We also, and this is a real point of contrast with like the heroes of the Iliad, see an Odysseus who's willing to get his hands dirty because what's the first thing he do? He builds a raft. He cuts down the trees himself. He makes the raft himself. He knows how to do handcrafts. He's not just out there like chopping people with swords. He is a builder and a worker. And he makes this boat, and it takes him part of the way. And then the boat breaks up, and that takes him part of the way, and then he's swimming. And so he wakes up, or he washes up on the beach in this place called Scheria. And he is, when he washes up, basically dead, right? Um, there is a very, I think, good sort of textbook case of an epic simile. It's kind of a literary device that Homer uses a lot. We'll say a word about that at lines 487 and following in book 5. This is where Homer says, just as um, a firebrand that has basically gone out is covered over with leaves to keep it burning. So Homer is covered over with leaves. So Odysseus is covered over with leaves to keep himself alive in this sort of bed that he makes for himself. The thing to note about these epic similes is that they tend to be multi-point comparisons, right? Odysseus is the brand, the fire is the life that is in him. The leaves are what is keeping the life going and also what's keeping the fire going. There are much more complicated ones that we'll see later on. I just wanted to point out this kind of simple case so that you know what an epic simile is when I mention epic similes later on. Okay, so he washes up on the beach and we see the kind of dilemma that Nestor was facing with Telemachus from the other point of view, right? Nestor was wondering, okay, is this guy a pirate? Is he just going to wreck everything? Odysseus is washing up and he's wondering, well, are these people going to treat me nice? Or are they going to do what we see that many of the folks that Odysseus meets in his adventures do and try to eat him or something like that? He's got this very kind of problematic situation where he needs to figure out a way to make contact with the people of this island and get some kind of help so that he doesn't die. Now, Athena once again has kind of and come up with a plot here, right? She sends Nausicaa and her friends out to do laundry, or she puts this idea in Nausicaa's head with the prompt that this is a way of preparing yourself for marriage. So in a way, Athena is saying, hey, why don't you go out and hunt a husband? And who should she find? But Odysseus, this potential husband, right? who doesn't look like a potential husband at first. He looks like a guy who's wearing a leaves for shorts, and is covered with salt and stuff. But he approaches the girls who are doing laundry very carefully. And he's lucky that Nausicaa, inspired by Athena, actually sticks around long enough to hear him out. And he's thinking, well, I should probably beg for my life, but maybe I should actually keep my distance because I look weird and threatening. And he gives this very good speech on Odysseus's part, um, comparing Nausicaa to a god, targeted comparison to Artemis, who is paradigmatically the virgin god, the god of young women, which Nausicaa is, and then mentioning the prospect of marriage, saying, lucky would be the guy who got to marry you. Right? So there is a contact scenario that Athena has set up where Nausicaa and Odysseus are potentially getting married, which becomes a little bit more plausible after Athena gives him one of his many glow-ups, which allows Odysseus to get into town and make this kind of careful approach, and avoid the danger that comes with encountering strangers, which is a real danger in the case of Phaeacia, the city that's on Scheria, which is known, Athena warns him about, for disliking strangers, for treating strangers poorly. And so you could imagine, I don't know if Odysseus had encountered somebody else when he got to the island. Say, one of the dudes that he wrangles with in book 8, this first encounter would have gone very differently. There are gendered aspects to this encounter that make it work, that Athena sets up. Of course, there's another hazard that comes out of this, something that continues to come up as a problem in books 7 and 8 and even 9 a little bit, where people actually want Odysseus to stay and marry Nausicaa, which is bad news for him because his whole deal is he wants to go home. There's this thing which is called xenia, which is just the way you treat a stranger, which is a hugely important concept in the Odyssey. Emily Wilson talks about this a bit in the introduction. Um, you got to be nice to a stranger. That's the rule of xenia. As Nausicaa says, all foreigners and beggars come from Zeus, right? Zeus Xenios, he's the protector of foreigners and beggars who show up at your door. You got to give them a meal and help them out. There is such a thing as too much xenia. That's what Odysseus gets from Calypso. That's what Odysseus has to avoid getting from the Scaearians, right? Too much xenia is where you get stuck, is where they won't let you leave. They treat you so well that you can't go anywhere. Xenia is a balance. You got to do the basic thing, but you got to not do too much of it. Right? And this is the situation that Odysseus gets himself into when he finally meets Arete, the queen of Phaeacia, who he supplicates, whose knees he embraces, the thing that he wanted to do now to Nausicaa, but thought was a bad idea, and her husband Alcinous, both of whom are thinking, well, this guy looks pretty good. Maybe we can keep him around and get him to marry our marriageable daughter. It's a real threat that Odysseus has to deal with. And he has to deal with the kind of basic hostility to strangers the Phaeacians have in book 8 too, right? This the athletic contest book, which in Homer these books always seem a little bit boring. This one I think is really interesting, right? Because it's a book about strife. It's a book about good strife and bad strife. The Greeks thought strife came in two flavors. There's the kind of strife where you're competing according to rules, you're trying to outdo one another. Hesiod, another Greek poet, talks about this. Potter tries to outdo potter, sailor tries to outdo sailor, singer tries to outdo singer. It's competition that makes people do better. But then there's another flavor of strife. And that's where you're just beating one another with rocks, right? Strife that's violence. This book, book 8, where they're doing this athletic contest, is all about rule-bound competition, the good kind of strife that's threatening to flip over into bad kind of strife. You see this at the beginning of the book in the first song that Demodocus, an authorial self-insert, probably sings, the blind poet, about conflicts between Odysseus and Achilles at Troy, a conflict that is supposed to spur each of them to be better fighters. Now that kind of rule-bound competition is what is supposed to happen at the athletic contest, which goes fine until people start asking Odysseus to participate, which is a real catch-22 for him because he doesn't want to like beat his hosts at athletic stuff, but he can't just lose either because that makes him look bad. So that turns into this insult contest starting at about 159. Euryalus says, well, this guy's probably just a merchant who doesn't know how to do sports. Odysseus says, Euryalus, you're really just a himbo. You got no brains. You just got a nice body. And so this eventually results in Odysseus throwing a discus farther than anyone thought a discus could be thrown, proving that he does know athletics. And then saying, hey, I also know a lot of war stuff, like throwing spears and shooting arrows at people. It's a moment at which this athletic contest is really threatening to flip over into the bad type of strife. And how this resolves is that Alcinous, the king of Phaeacia, backs down. He says, we don't know how to do any of that fighting stuff, but we do know how to dance. Do you want to see us dance? And so they just watch dancing happen. And then at the end of the book, something happens that is sort of a bard contest, right? A bard contest is being set up because Odysseus basically pays Demodocus in stake, the currency of bards. They all love a stake. To try to sing a song about Troy, sing a song about the Trojan War. Now, what is that for? First of all, it gives Odysseus a chance to cry about it. You may have noticed that when people cry about things, this is a strong assertion of emotional attachment and also a way of proving their identity. Telemachus does the same thing back in book 4. It gives Odysseus a chance to cry about it, but more importantly, it gives Odysseus a chance to step into the bard fight and win, which is what he does in book 9, the book where he finally declares his identity. Amy Odysseus Laertiades. I'm a care to all clever men. I'm a real rascal. At the beginning of the book, he says this. It's the first time he's told the Phaeacians his name. Prior to that, he's just been some kind of anonymous stranger or beggar. But he tells them his name, and then he has to prove it. And he proves it by telling this story that he tells in books 9 through 12. A story that features a number of fairly well-known episodes, most of which are supposed to make his crew look like idiots. The thing with the Cicones, the Lotus Eaters. The Cyclops story is a real exception. Because there it looks like Odysseus is the one who gets everyone into trouble. And the way that that happens is that he sticks around expecting Xenia from the Cyclops. He expects to get good treatment. He expects treats from the Cyclops. The Cyclops doesn't want to give him treats. The Cyclops does not respect the rules of Xenia and in fact thinks that he is a good deal stronger than the gods. It's a example of bad Xenia, not doing the thing that you're supposed to do with guests and strangers. Now, what happens to the Cyclops, which is that he gets his eye burnt out by Odysseus, who's actually quite a clever guy in situations where where there are difficulties, where he's facing overwhelming force. He blinds the Cyclops and gets his way out of the cave. That's a kind of a warning to people who might choose not to give Odysseus Xenia. Right? And all of this stuff, remember, is being addressed to an audience of Phaeacians. He's saying, well, you should give me Xenia because not doing it, look where that gets you blinded. Now, there are other stories that tell us something about Xenia in these books. The story of Circe is certainly one. illustrated here on a vase where people are mid-translation, mid-transformation into a pig. Um, Circe is also a bad host because Circe is a tricksy host. And this is an example of too much Xenia, right? She wants everyone to stay as pigs or as her spouse. Um, a dangerous excess of guest friendship. Now, I think that we are running a little bit short on time here, and so we can come back to some of these things in books 11 and 12 next time as well, particularly the Journey to the Land of the Dead, which needs a lot more discussion than I can give it here. But I do want to talk a little bit about um, book 12, because this is the moment where Odysseus loses the rest of his companions. And he loses those companions because they choose to eat the cattle of the sun. It's their atasthelia, their greedy stupidity. Odysseus does everything he can in his storytelling to clear himself of blame for this. And it's probably here that he's sort of most clearly uh, interested in presenting himself in a certain way to the Phaeacians. As we'll see, he does end up getting off kind of scot-free for the death of all these people, and the Phaeacians do buy this story, um, which gets him a ride home, as we'll see next time when we get into book 13. We'll also talk a little bit about books 11 and 12 then, but I better wrap it up so we have a little bit of time for Q&A here.
Thanks, Martin. That was really helpful to untangle this story that been studying since high school, which was a really long time ago. Anyway, you disappeared from the screen. I hope you can come back.
Here I am.
Okay, there's some really wonderful questions coming in. Um, uh, and I'll talk about their kind of fall into two thematic groups. One is about translation, and the other group of questions are asking about kind of gender expectations and what it is, masculinity. And so maybe you can field this first pair. Um, uh, Emily Wilson's translation. How close do you think it is to the original, or what are its pros and cons? Does it
Yeah.
track the original Greek? And if you've been able to take a look at Daniel Mendelsohn or Michael Salat's new translations as well, um, what do you have to say about their different theories of translation and the way they approach the ancient text?
Well, I will try to address the first part of that question because it's the one that I can speak to most. I have not looked at those other translations, but I will say that the main virtue of Emily Wilson's translation, from my point of view as a teacher, is that A, it's written in a language that students can understand fairly easily, and B, the line numbers in the translation line up to the Greek exactly, um, with maybe one line's difference here or there. As a translation, it has virtues of its own. For instance, it works pretty hard to achieve a metrical effect that isn't dissimilar to dactylic hexameter. Um, it is generally accurate in its translation of key terms. I think the sonically it is a good sonic cover of Homer. Um, Particularly social terms having to do with slavery and social status, with family relations. Um, I think a flaw in Wilson's version is that it doesn't really capture the repetitiveness of Homer's prose. That is to say that she often skips formulae or epithets, these sort of phrases that Homer just uses over and over again. Um, or sort of maybe over translates them, makes them more meaningful in particular cases than you might think they are looking at the Greek. Uh, there are also some instances that seem to me like over translation, where she translates fearful as shy or courageous as not shy. Um, Generally speaking, language of inheritance that shows up in Wilson's version is not a real reflection of the Greek, where it's much more like this is a characteristic of your father, for instance, and she'll translate that as your inheritance or so. So there are places where she doesn't get the translation right, but on the whole, and having access to the original Greek, I like it as a translation more than the other older translations that I've read. Uh, there are other sort of more recent translations that I haven't looked at that might indeed be better.
And why do you think that the repetition of Homer that she minimizes, why do you think it's important? Isn't she doing us a favor by not being repetitive?
Well, I don't know. I think repetitiveness can be great in context. We all love that pop music, which is extremely repetitive, both in terms of metrical features and in terms of choruses. It just happens to be a feature of Homer's poetry that epithets and formulae sort of work like a drum beat within the poem. And sometimes they're doing like very targeted allusions to both other places in the Odyssey and the Iliad. So it can be informative to have them in there. But it would
Mm.
be very difficult to achieve the concision that I think is a major virtue of Wilson's translation if you were to include every single formula and epithet.
Um, there are a lot of people wondering about the expectations of masculinity in Homer's world. So, one person asked about Telemachus. He's described as a boy, but he's really about 20. So, at what age is he supposed to become a man and marry? Is he at that cusp right now? And related to that, another person asked about crying and how surprised. I mean, Telemachus, we meet him, and the first thing he does is burst into tears because people aren't listening to him. But this attendees observed that Odysseus is constantly shedding tears, which today seems like kind of a female notion of managing emotions. So, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. When I teach this as a class, there's like a whole class that I do on each of those questions, basically. And so I will try to give a quick version. They are very good questions. The first thing about gender expectations, like a major feature of archaic Greek gender expectations, is that they're strongly like age stratified in a way that they're not in the modern US. So there's sort of separate vocabulary for talking about young women and young men that is even has different grammatical genders. A young man is a neuter noun, whereas just a man is a masculine noun. This age stratification means that there is a very marked difference between boy and man, so that you might almost even consider them different gender categories. Now, for Telemachus in particular, at the age of 20, you know, when his father was 20, he was like heading off to fight the Trojan War and stuff. Yeah, at that age, uh, you should be more capable than Telemachus is. Why is he not a little bit more capable? This gets back to his father's absence in a very particular way, which is the being capable in the world of the Odyssey and the Iliad too, to an extent, means having a network of powerful male friends that you can depend on, uh, both to help you get a wife and to help you actually achieve things like getting these 108 nasty suitors out of your house. He doesn't have that network of friends, right? Athena is showing up and pretending to be his friend so that he can have older male friends who can teach him a little bit about how to behave and help him build that network. And what he's doing in taking these trips to visit Nestor um, and Menelaus is really building that network on the basis of his father's reputation. Whereas if Odysseus had been there, Odysseus would have hooked him up with these people directly. And so Telemachus would both have undergone a bit more education and would have more powerful allies to rely on. So that I think is what produces Telemachus's backwardness for his age, his very childish response to things, like for instance, bursting into tears of frustration when he can't get his way at the assembly. It's one way to cry, but of course, grown men also cry. Um, we see Odysseus cry a bunch. We see Menelaus cry a bunch. There are different ways of crying. There are different reasons for crying. Crying is not all one thing. I mean, it's a physical response, but in the world of Homer, it's not one thing. You have tears that you shed out of frustration, like Telemachus does, which can be very child-coded. You can have tears that you shed for somebody who is absent, tears of grief. And this is the kind of crying that it's totally okay to do for men, and they do it quite publicly all the time in Homer. Achilles is famously always shedding hot tears. And there are tears that you shed for your absent home. Um, that kind of crying is not as gendered. Um, so I hope that addresses those questions in part. They do deserve longer answers. Um, we're a bit over time, but maybe we could take a couple more questions if we have another question or two, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, well, maybe we can switch from the humans to the gods. Because someone wanted, these were interesting questions. You started by saying that Homer seems to have some divine knowledge about what the gods are up to. To what extent do you think this tracks who the ancient people thought these gods were, what their origin was? And related to that, and this is a question that's fascinating to me, is so much of the activities someone observed, particularly in Book 10, seem to resemble Leviticus in their sacrificial strategies. So, what can you say about the gods of Homer in kind of the broader ancient Near Eastern or ancient Mediterranean world?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Trying to address the way that the Greeks think about all this first. You may have noticed in book 7, the Phaeacians are talking as though the gods just come down there and hang out and eat with them all the time. So there's an idea that in certain sort of golden age or utopian places, like Phaeacia, like Ethiopia too, is mentioned at the beginning of the poem, um, humans and gods share commensality, right? They eat at the same table. And that is to say that in those situations, the gods are directly knowable to humans. This is not the deal in most of the world of the Odyssey, right? Athena shows up in forms that are difficult to recognize. Zeus gives signs in forms that are difficult to recognize. You have to do a certain amount of scrutiny to see those things for what they are. Now, that means that there's a theory behind there of a difference between the way that gods appear in the world in their true appearance, which is what Homer's kind of knowledge allows him to see. And this question of how to stage a divine epiphany or what that looks like seems to have been something that is getting into the heads of a lot of people who are doing Greek sacred art, statuary for temples, people who are staging Greek tragedies. Um, the project of making the gods apparent is one that people understand as kind of a cultural project, and Homer is part of that, right? He is making the gods appear in the way that they would appear if you were to sit across a table from them, which is something that the Greeks thought was kind of possible. Um, Now, the end of that commensality, the end of that shared meal, is also for the Greeks kind of a mythic point of origin for the rites of sacrifice, um, which are a particular type of sacrifice in Homer, which is not a sort of a Holocaust sacrifice where you burn the whole thing and give it to the gods, but where you give the gods a, let's say, bad portion of the animal, bones and fat, and save the good parts for humans. This is supposed to be a trick that Prometheus played on the gods when they were hanging out together with the humans, and that's why gods and humans don't eat together anymore, because the gods are mad about getting tricked and only having a claim to the bad meat. Um, there is, in actual historical fact, probably a good deal of Near Eastern influence on not just the way that Greeks conduct sacrifice, but in fact, most of the Greek pantheon, heavily rewritten through contact with Phoenicians, with Hittites at a period slightly before Homer was writing. Um, so, from that point of view, it would be reasonable to read Homeric religion and sort of later Greek religion as an offshoot of um, the Near Eastern, not monotheism, but various forms of Mesopotamian polytheism that had a lot of cultural cachet in the region and beyond.
Well, I think there are a few more questions that we're not going to get to, but I'd kind of like to plant them for next time, because people are wondering if we're even supposed to like Odysseus at all. Um,
I don't
and
think you should.
well, you don't, I don't,
Yeah.
or maybe he's an example of what not to do. Um, and let's see, what we're missing as modern readers, and back to what as modern readers and not modern listeners of the story. Um, and so maybe you can return to that next time, as well as if we get back into sacrifice, the trip to the underworld and the drinking of blood, because we all want to hear more about this in terms of what you know about ancient magic. Um, but I think we'll have to end it here for now. Um, uh, and to end, I'd like to thank Jessica Guild and Diana Hope for supporting this webinar, and we hope to see all of you next week. Thanks so much for coming.
Yeah. Thank you for coming, everyone. See you next week.